The air inside the packed auditorium was heavy with expectation. Cameras lined the aisles, lights glared against the polished floor, and the murmurs of the audience rose like a tide waiting to break. Then it happened. The insult came sharp, cutting through the noise like a blade. Donald Trump, his voice brimming with arrogance, leaned toward the microphone and barked the words, "Sit down, boy." The phrase echoed in the hall, bouncing off walls that had witnessed history, but rarely such brazen contempt. The crowd gasped, some froze in disbelief, others let out nervous laughs, unsure if they had really heard what they thought they heard. It was not just the word. It was the tone, the sneer, the condescension. In that moment, the insult reached far beyond one man. It reverberated across generations, pulling at the deepest scars of America's history. People shifted in their seats, some clutching their phones, others whispering, "Did he just say that?" It felt like a line had been crossed, one that could not be undone. Every eye in the room turned toward Barack Obama, who sat still, composed, his face unreadable, as if the weight of the remark was pressing down but not breaking him. For a few seconds, time itself seemed to pause. The tension was so thick it could be felt in the chest. Trump's smirk widened, feeding on the silence, as though daring anyone to challenge him. But silence did not mean weakness. In the stillness, there was power, a storm gathering, unseen but undeniable. The audience could feel it. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail, knowing this moment would be replayed again and again. Somewhere in the crowd, a voice muttered, "He went too far." Tweets were already flying. Clips were already being clipped. The world was already reacting even as the insult hung in the air. But the man it was directed at did not flinch. Obama's hands rested lightly on the table before him, steady, calm. He inhaled, the faintest lift of his chin signaling that he was not rattled, not shaken, not diminished. Instead, he seemed to be waiting for the perfect moment. The silence was about to break. And when it did, it would leave the entire country stunned. But what happened next left everyone watching in disbelief. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and though the sting of the insult was undeniable, what gave the moment its true weight was the history wrapped inside it. America was not just witnessing a clash of personalities, it was staring at the collision of two visions for the nation's soul. On one side stood a man who thrived on division, who believed that insults could reduce his opponents to silence. On the other stood someone who had built his career on calm resilience, on the power of words that unite rather than destroy. The confrontation was not only about two leaders, it was about the America people wanted to claim as their own. The audience shifted uneasily, their collective heartbeat echoing in the silence. It was not just about Obama being told to sit down. It was about the echo of every moment in history when dignity was mocked, when respect was withheld, when arrogance tried to define who was worthy and who was not. For many in the room, it was impossible not to hear the shadow of America's past, the chains of slavery, the marches for civil rights, the countless voices that had demanded recognition only to be met with sneers. The insult was personal, yes, but it was also national, historical, generational. Trump's supporters, scattered throughout the crowd, clapped and whistled, feeding the tension. But their cheers only revealed the divide more clearly. This was not just a rally or a debate. It had become a battlefield of ideology. Democracy versus demagoguery, respect versus ridicule, unity versus hate. The entire scene felt like a mirror being held up to the country, forcing it to confront its contradictions. Would America choose the path of division and contempt, or would it reclaim its values of dignity, equality, and truth? Obama remained motionless, but in his stillness was a message. He represented the millions of immigrants who had come to this country with nothing but hope. He represented the families who had endured prejudice and humiliation, yet refused to give up. He represented the young people who dreamed of a better America, and the elders who remembered how hard it had been to build progress in the first place. His silence carried the weight of those voices, and his eventual reply would not be just his own. It would belong to every American who had been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to accept less than their worth. The tension in the room was electric. Journalists leaned forward, scribbling furiously, knowing this was more than a headline. It was a turning point. Parents glanced at their children, wondering what lesson they would carry home from this. The cameras captured it all. Trump's smirk, the audience's unease, Obama's steady eyes. Outside the hall, millions were already watching the moment. Unfold on live streams, in Twitter threads, in texts buzzing from phone to phone. It was no longer confined to the walls of the auditorium. It had become a national drama in real time. And beneath it all, one question pulsed louder than any voice in the room. How would Obama respond? Everyone knew he would answer. The real suspense was how and whether that answer would cut deeper than the insult that had ignited the fire. The moment mattered because the nation's identity was on the line, and every second of silence drew the country closer to revelation. Viewers knew they were about to witness history. Long before the insult echoed through the hall, Donald Trump had crafted a persona built on provocation. For years he had thrived on spectacle, turning press conferences into arenas, interviews into shouting matches, and debates into theaters of insult. He understood the power of outrage, and he wielded it like a weapon. What many saw as recklessness, he saw as strategy. Keep the cameras pointed at him, keep the headlines screaming his name, keep the nation in a constant state of reaction. His rise was not an accident. It was the byproduct of arrogance masquerading as confidence, cruelty disguised as strength. But beneath the surface of his bravado lay contradictions that could never fully be hidden. Here was a man who promised to fight for the forgotten American worker while outsourcing his own products overseas. A man who spoke of law and order while leaving a trail of lawsuits, unpaid contractors, and business bankruptcies. A man who claimed to be the voice of the people while cloaking himself in gold-plated towers and private jets. These hypocrisies clung to him like shadows, and though his supporters cheered louder with every controversy, the truth was impossible to ignore. His empire, built on bluster, was always on shaky ground. The insult hurled at Obama was not an isolated moment. It was part of a long pattern, one that revealed his instinct to belittle rather than debate, to demean rather than dignify. From mocking immigrants as criminals to ridiculing women in the most degrading terms, Trump had made a career out of drawing lines between us and them. Every word he spoke was designed to divide, to pit neighbor against neighbor, to remind America that he thrived when people were at odds. His rallies, charged with chants and anger, had become symbols of that division, places where he painted entire communities as enemies to be feared rather than citizens to be embraced. Flashbacks of his earlier controversies rippled through the public consciousness as the insult replayed online. People remembered the years he had spent demanding to see Obama's birth certificate, weaving a baseless conspiracy that questioned the legitimacy of the nation's first black president. They remembered the time he described countries with large immigrant populations in the most degrading terms imaginable, words that shocked the world but energized his base. They remembered the families torn apart at the border, the cages filled with children, the tear gas that stung the faces of migrants who had believed America still held its promise. For many, his words were not simply offensive. They were cruel reminders of lived pain. What made the arrogance sting even more was how he wore it proudly, as though decency itself was weakness. In his world, compassion was for losers. Empathy was unnecessary, and respect was earned only through domination. Yet even as he mocked and insulted, there were cracks that showed through. His overreactions, his constant need to prove himself, his obsession with control all betrayed an insecurity he could not fully hide. The louder he shouted, the clearer it became that he feared losing the spotlight. That fear drove him to escalate, to insult with more venom, to attack with more force. In his desperation to appear unshakable, he revealed just how fragile his foundation truly was. For those watching the confrontation unfold, these contradictions were impossible to ignore. His insult toward Obama felt like the culmination of years of grievance and contempt, but it also felt like overreach. There was something in the air that night, something different. This was not just another soundbite, another cruel joke tossed into the ether. This moment carried with it the possibility of a reckoning. Even some who had once cheered his brashness began to wonder if he had finally crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Obama's silence, calm and unbroken, became its own kind of mirror. It reflected Trump's arrogance back at him, exposing its emptiness. The longer Obama sat without reacting, the more Trump's smirk seemed forced, the more his bravado appeared brittle. It was as though the insult had been a spark meant to ignite dominance, but instead it flickered into something else, a glimpse of weakness. In that tension, in that stillness, lay the seeds of downfall. Because arrogance, when pushed too far, often plants the very trap it seeks to avoid. The audience could not yet know how the night would unfold, but they could sense it. Trump's insult was not only a slap at his opponent, it was a revelation of his own unraveling character. His arrogance had always been his weapon, but in this moment, it threatened to become the weight that pulled him down. And as the silence deepened, the question shifted. No longer was it whether Obama would respond, but how devastating that response might be when it finally came. Barack Obama had heard worse before. He had faced subtle dismissals, whispered doubts, outright slurs, and the endless questions about whether he belonged. The insult flung at him that night was not new in spirit. It was the echo of a lifetime of challenges that had forced him to cultivate calm in the face of contempt. To understand why he did not flinch, why his silence carried more weight than Trump's sneer, one had to understand the path that brought him there. He was the son of a Kenyan immigrant and a woman from Kansas, raised between cultures, oceans, and worlds that never fully understood one another. As a child, he was told he was too different, that his name was too strange, that his skin marked him as someone who would always be questioned. Those lessons were harsh, but they also carved something essential into him: resilience. Every time someone tried to define him, he found a way to define himself. Every time the world tried to tell him to sit down, he found a way to stand taller. His journey was never paved with certainty. He worked his way through college halls where few faces looked like his, entering classrooms where the weight of history pressed down. He walked through neighborhoods where the American dream seemed just out of reach, listening to the voices of workers, mothers, immigrants, and elders who carried hope alongside struggle. Those voices shaped him. They became the chorus that guided him into public service, reminding him that leadership was not about ego, but about responsibility. By the time he entered politics, Obama had already endured 1,000 small dismissals. He had been called inexperienced, naive, unqualified. Yet he turned each dismissal into fuel. He spoke of unity when others demanded division, of hope when cynics scoffed, of dignity when arrogance tried to dominate. His campaign speeches were not just political messages. They were lifelines thrown to people who had long felt unseen. When he told America that, "Yes, we can," it was not a slogan. It was a reclamation of the voices that had been told for generations, "No, you cannot." What made his presence so powerful in that auditorium was not simply the office he had held, but the story he carried with him. He embodied the struggles of immigrant families who arrived with accents and were told they would never belong. He carried the memory of Black Americans who had marched across bridges and faced down dogs and fire hoses for the right to be heard. He reflected the perseverance of workers who clocked long hours with little recognition, the courage of young dreamers who built lives in a country that debated their existence, the quiet strength of elders who believed change was worth the fight, even when they might not live to see it. Obama's calm was not detachment, it was discipline. He had learned that outrage could be used against him, that anger could be twisted into a caricature. So he honed the art of patience, of waiting, for the right moment, of turning the attack back onto the attacker, not with louder words, but with sharper truth. In his stillness was strategy, and in his restraint was power. That was why the insult, as cruel as it was, did not shake him. He had faced storms before and learned that the way to weather them was not to shout louder, but to stand taller. Even now, as Trump's words reverberated, Obama's mind was not on himself alone. He was thinking of the people who would hear the insult as their own dismissal. He was thinking of the children watching at home, the ones who had been bullied for their names, their accents, their skin. He was thinking of the workers who had been disrespected by bosses who believed arrogance was strength, of the families who had endured indignities from leaders who forgot they served the people. His silence in that moment was his way of carrying them, of holding their dignity and his composure until the time came to speak. And yet, for all his discipline, there was steel beneath the calm. Obama had always known that words could change the course of history, and he had used them like a craftsman shaping iron. The insult had given him an opening, and he knew instinctively that his reply would not just be a defense, it would be a turning point. He had been preparing for moments like this his entire life, moments where restraint met opportunity, where dignity became defiance, where history shifted because one man chose to rise above instead of sink below. As the audience watched him breathe, as cameras locked on his unshaken expression, they could not see the storm gathering inside him, but they could feel it. His composure was not weakness. It was the calm before the strike. He knew his response would not simply reclaim his own dignity, it would expose the arrogance before him for what it truly was, empty, fragile, unsustainable. This was the moment his entire journey had prepared him for. And the nation, though it did not yet know, was about to see why. The silence that followed Trump's insult could not last forever. It bent under its own weight until the moderator, shifting nervously in his chair, tried to nudge the conversation forward. But the air in the room was charged, alive, unwilling to move on. The tension was no longer simply between two men. It was pulsing through the crowd, through the millions watching at home, through a nation split between applause for cruelty and yearning for dignity. And when the debate pressed on, it did not move gently. It erupted. Trump leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the disruption he had caused, and continued to jab. His words were sharp, laced with contempt, each one designed to provoke. He mocked Obama's legacy, belittled his accomplishments, and sneered at the idea that his presidency had meant anything at all. His hands chopped the air with exaggerated gestures, his voice climbing higher, sharper, angrier. The crowd fed on the performance, some clapping, others booing, the clash of reactions creating a thunder of discord that shook the hall. For Trump, this was victory. Chaos meant dominance. But Obama did not bite. He watched, his eyes steady, his posture calm. And the more composed he remained, the more Trump grew unsettled. It was as if Trump's insults were tennis balls hurled across the court only to be met with silence, falling flat at his opponent's feet. The imbalance rattled him. He spoke faster, louder, the sneer turning into something closer to desperation, though he tried to mask it with bravado. The more he pushed, the more obvious the contrast became, an agitator on one side, a statesman on the other. The moderator tried again to restore order, but the escalation was unstoppable. Trump raised his voice, calling Obama weak, un-American, a failure. His words echoed with the same hostility that had colored so many of his past speeches, words meant to divide, to pit communities against each other. Yet every insult carried less weight as the crowd watched Obama's restraint. The former president was not cowed, nor was he angry. He was waiting, measuring, letting the insults pile high so that when he finally spoke, the collapse would be undeniable. The audience sensed it too. Some leaned forward, whispering, waiting for the inevitable moment. Phones glowed in the dark, tweets already drafting themselves. When is he going to answer? Someone muttered under their breath. The suspense was unbearable. The nation was no longer just listening to Trump, it was holding its breath for Obama. Trump's attacks grew sloppier. He circled the same points, repeating himself, trying to force a reaction that never came. He ridiculed Obama's roots, mocked his speeches, and even dismissed the idea that Obama had ever represented the real America. Each word was meant to sting, but instead they revealed the fragility beneath Trump's performance. His voice cracked once, barely perceptible, but enough to show the strain. His smirk faltered, replaced by irritation. And though his insults still rained down, their power was slipping away with every passing second. Obama finally shifted in his seat, not with haste, but with purpose. The simple act of leaning forward, of placing his hands firmly on the table, drew the eyes of everyone in the room. The hall quieted, sensing the moment was near. Trump's voice, still barking insults, suddenly sounded hollow against the backdrop of that poised silence. It was clear to anyone watching, the escalation had reached its peak. The air was no longer charged with Trump's bluster, it was charged with anticipation of Obama's answer. And when he finally opened his mouth, the room would no longer belong to Trump. Obama's voice cut through the tension like a blade, low at first, measured, almost conversational. The sudden calm startled the room. People leaned in, drawn closer, not because he shouted, but because he did not need to. It was the kind of silence that commanded attention before the first sentence was even finished. "Donald," he began, his tone steady, "you have made a career out of tearing people down. You thrive on insults, on division, on fear. But let us be clear tonight. America is not built on fear. America is built on hope, and you cannot insult that out of existence." The crowd reacted instantly. Some gasped, some cheered, and others froze, stunned by the sharp contrast. For the first time in the evening, Trump's smirk wavered. He tried to interject, but the moderator raised a hand, giving Obama the floor. The stage, once a chaotic battlefield, now belonged entirely to him. Obama leaned forward, locking his gaze on Trump. His words sharpened. "You mock the poor, you dismiss immigrants, you laugh at women, and you ridicule anyone who is different from you. That is not strength. That is weakness dressed up as arrogance. And the truth is, deep down, you know it." The words landed. Heavy, each syllable deliberate, each sentence more devastating than the last. The crowd erupted, a mix of applause and shock. Trump's lips tightened. He leaned toward his microphone, ready to bark back, but Obama raised his hand slightly. Not to silence him, but to underline dominance. "You talk about making America great again?" Obama continued, his voice rising now. "But greatness is not measured by how many people you insult on Twitter. Greatness is measured by how you lift people up when they are down. By how you unite, not divide. By how you build, not how you destroy." The audience roared. Phones lit up as people typed furiously, already declaring the moment a turning point. Even those in the crowd who came in as skeptics could not deny the power in Obama's delivery. It was not simply a counter-argument. It was a dismantling, brick by brick, of everything Trump had just thrown at him. Trump interrupted, his voice cracking slightly. "You are all talk, Barack. 8 years and you left this country weaker, poorer, and more divided than ever. That is your legacy." Obama tilted his head slightly, almost smiling. Then he delivered the line that would echo across social media, headlines, and history books within hours. "My legacy," he said firmly, "is not measured by how loud I shout. It is measured by the millions of families who had health care for the first time, by the children of immigrants who believed they belonged in this country, by soldiers who came home from wars you never understood. My legacy is not tweets, Donald. It is people, and they are stronger than your insults will ever be." The reaction was electric. Some people jumped to their feet. The sound of applause rattled the walls. Cameras zoomed in on Trump, whose face flushed a deep shade of red. His jaw tightened. His hand gripped the microphone, but no sound came out. He was cornered, not by aggression, but by truth spoken with precision. Obama pressed on, his voice rising to its peak. "You see, Donald, history does not remember bullies fondly. History does not celebrate those who tear apart the weak. History remembers those who had the courage to stand for something greater than themselves. And when your time is up, people will not remember your insults. They will remember how small they made you look." Gasps rippled across the room. Even the moderator, who had tried so hard to stay neutral, could not disguise the stunned look on his face. The blow had landed. It was not just an argument anymore. It was a public humiliation. Trump tried one last time to retake control, stammering about fake news, witch hunts, and conspiracies. But the words fell flat. His voice, once booming with confidence, now trembled under the weight of Obama's dismantling. The audience, sensing the collapse, grew restless. Every time he spoke, they responded with groans, with jeers, with laughter. The power he had fed on all night was gone. Obama sat back slightly, letting the silence hang again, before delivering the final strike. His tone softened, almost compassionate, though the words cut deeper than any insult could. "You wanted to make this debate about me," he said quietly, "but tonight has shown America the truth. This was never about me. This is about you. And when history tells your story, it will not be a story of greatness. It will be a warning." The hall exploded. The sound was deafening, a wave of applause, cheers and chants that swept through the audience and spilled across every television screen. In living rooms across the nation, people replayed the moment, sharing clips, adding captions, flooding timelines. Hashtags trended within minutes. Obama's warning became the phrase of the night. Trump sat frozen, his face stiff, his body tense. For the first time in memory, he had no line to fall back on, no insult to mask the silence. His brand, built on dominating every stage, had cracked under the weight of a single devastating exchange. And the cameras caught it all: the hesitation, the discomfort, the look of a man outmatched not by volume, but by conviction. The moderator, his voice trembling slightly, finally interjected, "Gentlemen, we must move on." But the debate had already been decided. Every word that followed, every topic raised, was overshadowed by what had just happened. The moment was burned into the night. Obama did not gloat. He did not smirk or raise his fist. He simply leaned back, composed, calm, as though he had known all along that this moment would come. And in that calmness was his triumph. The mic drop was not a gesture, not a theatrical stunt. It was the power of words, delivered with precision, echoing louder than any shout ever could. It was the kind of moment that would live in memory, replayed endlessly, a reminder of how a single line can silence even the loudest voice in the room. And for Trump, it was the humiliation he could never undo. For most of the evening, the tension had been unbearable, like a taut string threatening to snap at any moment. The antagonist had dominated the airwaves with insults, weaving half-truths into his speeches and turning applause into a weapon. Supporters in the hall cheered, while others sat in grim silence, waiting for a counterpunch. The stage lights reflected off the polished podium, and the air carried a static charge, as if the entire room understood that something irreversible was about to happen. The villain had built his case on division, attempting to frame immigrants, minorities, and anyone who stood against him as the enemy of progress. He stood tall, feeding off the energy of his base, convinced that he had cornered his opponent. But what he did not realize was that the tide of history had already begun to turn. The camera cut to the hero, standing steady, shoulders squared. His silence was deliberate, his pause stretched long enough for the crowd to grow restless. Then, in a voice clear and unwavering, he began. He did not return fire with insults or mockery. Instead, he spoke with precision, choosing words that pierced through the noise and revealed the truth. He reminded the room of promises broken by the antagonist, of families torn apart by policies designed not to unite but to punish, of workers betrayed by leaders who claimed to champion them while quietly enriching themselves. Every sentence was a mirror held up to the villain's face, and the reflection was damning. The audience shifted uneasily. Some supporters of the antagonist folded their arms defensively, but others began to listen more closely than they expected. The hero leaned forward slightly, voice firm but calm, and laid bare the hypocrisy. He recalled how the antagonist once boasted about lifting up the forgotten, yet left them stranded when the cameras were gone. He reminded them of photo ops staged in factories that later closed, of promises to veterans overshadowed by indifference when the spotlight dimmed. Piece by piece, he dismantled the carefully built facade until only the raw ambition and disregard for people remained visible. The room grew quieter. The cheers softened. Even those who had entered expecting a one-sided spectacle began to recognize a shift. It was not just a debate anymore, it was an unveiling. The antagonist's smirk faltered ever so slightly, and that single flicker of doubt electrified the atmosphere. The hero pressed forward, invoking not just facts, but values, the shared ideals that transcended party and identity. Democracy, he said, is not about silencing others, but about hearing them. Freedom is not about tearing families apart, but giving them the chance to thrive. Unity is not weakness. It is the strength that built a nation. His words landed with the weight of conviction, each one chiseling away at the wall of bluster the villain had constructed. And then, the line. It came not as a shout, but as a statement delivered with unshakable certainty, a sentence that captured the entire struggle in a single blow. The hero looked directly at his opponent, his gaze unwavering, and declared that America was not built by fearmongers or con men. It was built by the very people the antagonist tried to erase from the story. The silence that followed was thunderous. Even those watching from their living rooms could feel the shift. Something cracked open in that moment, and the momentum that had seemed impossible to turn now surged toward the other side. The antagonist tried to respond, but his words stumbled, his rhythm broken. The charm of arrogance no longer held sway because the mask had slipped. Viewers across the country leaned forward, breath held, realizing they were watching not just a clash of personalities, but a battle for the soul of a nation. The turning point had arrived, and there would be no going back. What came next would decide everything. The room had shifted. What only minutes earlier had felt like the antagonist's territory now seemed alien to him. His usual weapons, mockery, exaggeration, half-truths, no longer struck with the same force. Instead, each attempt to claw back control sounded hollow, as though the crowd had suddenly grown immune to the performance. He leaned against the podium, his voice louder than before, but the desperation behind it was unmistakable. For years, his strength had been his ability to command attention, to dominate a stage with showmanship and bravado. Now, stripped of his rhythm, the performance seemed like a parody of itself. The audience responded in kind. Where there had been thunderous applause earlier, there was now scattered clapping, uneven and uncertain. A few loyal voices tried to cheer, but their sound was drowned by the weight of silence. The cameras panned across faces in the crowd. Furrowed brows, uneasy eyes, supporters whispering to one another as doubt crept into the room. The antagonist noticed. His gestures grew sharper, his tone harsher, his body language restless. He tried to laugh off the blow he had received, but the laughter sounded strained, hollow, a mask slipping with every word. The hero did not gloat. He stood calm, hands resting gently on the podium, his expression steady. He let the silence hang, giving the villains unraveling enough space to be seen clearly. This was not a battle to be won with more noise. It was a contest of endurance, and the antagonist had already lost his footing. The hero spoke again, not with anger, but with gravity. He described the ordinary people who had been forgotten in the antagonist's shadow games. The parents working 2 jobs while promises of prosperity evaporated, the children growing up without health care while tax breaks fattened the powerful, the veterans left behind after being paraded for political theater. His voice carried the weight of their stories, and each one struck harder than any insult could. The antagonist's face reddened. He cut in, interrupting with shouts, pointing fingers, waving his hands wildly. But the interruption only emphasized the collapse. The contrast was stark. One figure composed, deliberate, rooted in principle. The other frantic, unraveling under the glare of truth. The cameras did not lie. Millions of viewers could see the panic rising in the villain's eyes, the cracks spreading in his carefully crafted image. The spectacle he had relied on for so long was turning against him. Instead of appearing strong, he looked small. The moderator tried to rein him in, but the antagonist was already slipping beyond control, his words colliding in a stream of grievances and contradictions. Every attempt to pivot back to dominance made the collapse more obvious. He blamed the press, he blamed immigrants, he blamed his opponent, he blamed the system itself, but none of it landed. Instead of power, it reeked of desperation. The hall felt heavier with each passing moment, as if the collective realization had set in that the performance was over, the illusion broken. The hero delivered one more blow, not through insult, but through clarity. He reminded the audience that leadership is not measured by how loudly one can shout or how many enemies one can create, but by the ability to lift people when they are down. He said that fear might win a night, but hope builds a lifetime. The words resonated, echoing in the silence that followed. The cameras cut again to the crowd, this time heads nodding, lips murmuring agreement. The villain had lost more than the debate. He had lost the grip on the narrative he once commanded with ease. And then came the collapse in its rawest form. The antagonist lashed out one final time, raising his voice in a tirade that spiraled into incoherence. He shouted over the moderator, over his opponent, over the very crowd that had once cheered him without hesitation. His words dissolved into fragments of grievance, old slogans repeated like broken echoes. He slammed his hand against the podium, but instead of authority, it radiated weakness. The hall did not roar, it recoiled. Viewers at home saw not a leader, but a man unraveling under the weight of his own contradictions. The debate ended not with applause, but with silence. A silence more deafening than any chorus of cheers. The hero stood tall, unshaken, while the antagonist lingered in the harsh glow of the lights, his face a portrait of fury and defeat. For years he had thrived on chaos, but tonight chaos had betrayed him. The collapse was complete, and as the cameras faded to black, the nation knew that something fundamental had shifted forever. The room was no longer the same. The echo of that final exchange lingered like thunder after a storm, and in its silence, something shifted. For those who had watched with folded arms, waiting to see if truth could stand against bluster, the answer had been delivered with clarity. The crowd that had come divided left with a sense that history had tilted, even if only by an inch. That inch mattered. It always did. Because democracy was not defended in sweeping declarations alone. It was defended in these tense, raw, uncomfortable confrontations where lies were unmasked in real time. The antagonist sat back, his face flushed with the sting of defeat disguised as defiance. Cameras zoomed in on every twitch of his jaw, every forced smirk. He tried to appear unfazed, but the audience saw what he could not hide, the unraveling of the myth he had built around himself. For years he had thrived on the illusion of strength, on the belief that shouting louder meant winning. But in that moment, silence carried more power than his words ever could, and that silence belonged to the hero who dared to stand, unwavering against a tide of falsehoods. Viewers at home felt it in their chests. They saw their own battles reflected in that exchange, the times they had been silenced at work, dismissed in classrooms, or mocked for speaking truths that others were too afraid to hear. Suddenly, this was not just about politics, it was about dignity. It was about being seen, being heard, and realizing that even when power sneered in your face, resilience had a way of shining through. The confrontation had become a mirror, reminding millions that they too had a role to play in shaping the story of their country. And as the lights dimmed, as the commentators prepared to dissect every word, one reality hung above all the noise. This was not the end. This was a spark. A single moment of truth had broken through the performance of lies, and those who had witnessed it would carry it forward. Democracy had not just survived the clash, it had been renewed by it. And as the hero walked away, not victorious in a spectacle, but resolute in truth, the world knew something undeniable. The fight for the soul of America was not over. It had only just begun. From the very first moment of this story, one truth has been clear. Arrogance may dominate the headlines, but it cannot outlast the power of honesty. We have watched an antagonist built on bluster and contradiction face the weight of his own words, and we have seen how quickly that facade crumbles when held against the steady force of conviction. This was more than a clash of personalities. It was a revelation that truth, no matter how pressured, always finds its way to the surface. If this journey has reminded us of anything, it is that every act of courage matters. Every voice raised against deceit, every stand taken for dignity, every refusal to bend under intimidation adds to a chorus that grows louder than any single lie. that is what we witnessed here. The timeless story of truth outshining arrogance, of resilience turning the tide when cynicism said it could not be done. And now, that story does not end here. It continues with you. By subscribing, by sharing this message, by joining this community, you become part of something larger than yourself. You are not just a viewer. You are a voice, a witness, and a force within a movement determined to keep truth alive in a time that desperately needs it. This is more than commentary. This is a call to action. Stand with us. Add your strength to this fight. Because together, we are not simply telling stories, we are reshaping them, reclaiming them, and proving that when we stand firm, no arrogance can outshine the light of truth. Subscribe, share, and step into the movement that refuses to be silenced. From the moment this story began, the contrast was undeniable. On one side stood arrogance, loud, unshaken, certain that power alone could rewrite reality. On the other stood truth, quiet, resilient, but unbreakable. We followed the journey of deception built on ego, only to watch it falter when confronted by conviction and moral clarity. What started as a display of dominance ended as a lesson in humility. The mask of confidence cracked, and beneath it lay the same weakness that always follows those who mistake bluster for strength. This has never just been about one individual. It is about a pattern we have seen time and again, where those who believe themselves untouchable eventually find that truth has been waiting for them all along. No matter how loud the performance, no matter how carefully the image is staged, reality cannot be silenced. In the end, arrogance burns out, but truth endures. That is the lesson worth carrying forward. Not as distant spectators, but as participants in a greater story. Each of us has a choice, to remain silent in the face of lies, or to stand up, speak out, and join a community that refuses to be swayed by intimidation. When you subscribe, when you share, when you add your voice, you are choosing to stand with truth against the weight of deception. This channel is more than commentary. It is a movement built on courage, dignity, and the belief that justice belongs to those who fight for it. So if this story resonated with you, take the next step. Subscribe now. Share this message. Be part of something larger than yourself. Together, we are not just exposing arrogance, we are proving that truth, always and forever, shines brighter.